Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Bromlog, and I strongly suggest you watch the part one of this where I go over Bordiga's biography and discuss a little bit about the context for this article. This article is from the In Defense of Marxism website, which is a Ted Grant and slash currently led by, I believe, Alan Woods, inspired group from the UK. I would say a fairly traditional deformed worker state kind of Trotskyist group. And you need to know the difference between left communism and the left opposition, although in the 1930s, these terms were often confused. Left communists were generally marginalized in the international, and the common term for taking anti-electoral and or anti-trade union positions. These two groups are generally associated with the Italian left communists, led by people who identified with Bordiga, who we're going to cover, the Dutch and German left communists, who identified with figures like Anton Pannekoek, Jan Appel, and figures such as that. And the French left communists, who tended to be inspired by one or the other, are even mixed the two. The Bordigist tradition today was both inspiration for a lot of the communization debates of the teens, of the 20 teens, but they were also influential on, of course, the International Communist Party, the ICP, and both versions. The International Communist Current and the International Communist Tendency, as well as new groups whose names I don't all know. All right. Now, we're going to go into these distinctions because they're somewhat relevant here. Okay, let's get into this article. This article is by Roberto Sarti, who I believe is an Italian writer, often working with the IMT. And this is an interesting article in that it is sympathetic to Gramsci, but argues that procedurally Bordiga was done wrong. So we'll get into this article today. I want to point out that I think this is told from the Trotskyist perspective of this situation, and particularly the Grantite Trotskyist perspective, and that's important to note. All right. The conflict between Gramsci and Bordiga in the early days of the Italian Communist Party and the Lyon Theses. This article explains the disagreement and political errors that marred the early Congress of the Communist Party of Italy. The Lyon Congress of 1926 was a culmination of the contradictory nature of the Communist Party of Italy, which compounded by bureaucratic degeneration of the Third International, tragically contributed to the defeat of the Italian communists, alongside the rest of the workers' movement at the hands of fascism. So we see fascism is treated here as triumphant, which it kind of was. But this actually makes it seem like that fascism ended the Italian left, which it absolutely did not. So it's going to be interesting to look at here. The first years of the Communist Party of Italy were born out of the Livorno split of the Italian Socialist Party, the PSI, in 1921, after the PSI leadership had played a treacherous role during the occupation of the factories a few months earlier, and were intense and difficult. The young and inexperienced party had to face challenges that were unprecedented for the communist movement. How to fight fascism, an unfamiliar reactionary phenomenon, one that had come out of the PSI itself, which is something this article does not deal with, and how to engage with the Communist International, whose strategic and tactical orientation decided at the 4th and 5th Congresses the young party did not share. That was soon thereafter taken over by the process of bureaucratic generation underway in the International's leading the party, the Russian Bolsheviks. Now, it's interesting that this focuses on bureaucratic degeneration, since this is not the IMT is not a bureaucratic collective thesis on the problems of the Soviet Union. For those of you who don't know what that is, go back and see my episodes on the rise and decline of Trotskyism in the United States. The party born at Livorno was dominated by the ideas of Amadeo Bordiga, June 13th, 1889 to July 23rd, 1970, who was recognized as the leader and founder of the Communist Party of Italy. He had played a key role in organizing the most intransigent revolutionary wing of the PSI, and therefore had great authority within the ranks of the new party. And although he was a revolutionary of great stature, he unfortunately adopted an ultra-left position and rejected the United Front tactic devised by the leadership of the Communist International. He did, although, as we discussed in biography, he accepted a united front from below, which was actually the same position later taken during Third Periodism after 1927 by the Comintern itself. So make of that what you will. Even though he was out of sync with the Comintern in that time, and maybe specifically in the context of Italy, Third Periodism in general had a position pretty close to what Bordiga actually held. So we'll get back to that in a minute. He had been the most determined in preparing the split from the Italian Socialist Party. He had succeeded in uniting the left communist current in Milan with its leaders Forticiari and Riposi, a group of maximalist centrists behind Gennari, and a group of the Ordine Nouveau around himself and his faction, represented by the paper Il Soviet. Gramsci and Terracini were on the Central Committee from the beginning. So Gramsci, despite their antagonism, and as I mentioned in the biography, their antagonism lessened while they were both in prison by the fascists in the late 1920s and early 1930s, was one of the original Central Committee members, along with Bordiga, and Gramsci represented what we might call the center of the party. The split, although necessary, did not resolve on its own problem of creating a revolutionary leadership in Italy. It merely created the basis of one upon which to build it. The Second Congress of the Communist Party of Italy, debates within the Comintern, and in particular, the polemic over whether the correctness of the United Front tactics as a means of winning over the ranks of the Social Democratic parties was not a purely theoretical or abstract disagreement, and it had very practical consequences, as was be tragically demonstrated in Italy in that period. I do find it interesting we're not mentioning Third Periodism in this article. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Second Congress of the Communist Party of Italy, held in Rome in March of 1922, contained the essence of Bordiga's thought: the rejection of any form of cooperation with social democracy and a refusal to adopt the slogan for workers' government. The United Front tactic was accepted by the Italian communists only on the industrial front. It was acceptable to work with De Aragona, the leader of the CGL Union Federation, but not Torati, the right-wing PSI leader. We talked a little bit about this in the biography episode 2. In terms of political perspectives, the Communist Party of Italy saw on the horizon the opening of a social democratic phase in Italy. Social democracy would bring together all the other parties in the government of national unity. This sounds like popular frontism, actually. This perspective was shared by the overwhelming majority of the party leadership. See the words by Gramsci. Quote, "The same process will take place in Italy as in other capitalist countries. Against the advance of the working classes, a coalition of reactionary elements will form, from the fascist to the Popular Party and the Socialist. Actually, the Socialists will become the vanguard of the anti-proletarian reaction because they know best the weaknesses of the working class." Paulo Spiro, The Story of the Communist Party of Italy, Volume 1, Bordiga and Gramsci, except in Italian. All right. It must be acknowledged, as Trotsky did later, that Gramsci was the only one who didn't rule out a victory of fascism in Italy. Nonetheless, in 1921-1922, the tactics of the Communist Party of Italy were guided by incorrect and sectarian positions. Let's see what they are. I do think we have to acknowledge that that's like incorrect and sectarian, the correctness has to be decided by something, and those grounds are not given here. Sectarian Marxist groups tend to call things correct, and other people sectarian, while also not defining exactly how those terms should be generally applied. Although maybe the IMT does in other places. Clearly, the tactic of the United Front against fascism was considered useless if social democracy and fascism were going to make a deal and become part of the same camp. For those of you who want a history of this is where I'm talking, go listen to or read the works of Zeev Sternhell and the way the right of social democracy and the left of fascism and Nazism had a strong overlap, in that the socialists, both in Italy and in third period Marxist-Leninism, weren't coming from nowhere. All right. It would appear that unless useless even to those who, unlike Bordiga, didn't consider non-collaboration with social democracy a question of principle. On Trotsky's initiative, the Comintern harshly criticized these theses. See this letter from the Presidium of the Communist Party International. We invite the Communist Party to fight for the dissolution of the Chamber of Deputies in order to install a workers' government. By establishing a minimum program for the demands to be met by the workers' government, the communists must declare themselves ready to form a bloc with the Social Democratic Party and support it, insofar as it defends the interests of the working class. If the PSI accepts, the struggles will begin, which will be transported from parliamentary field of action to other fields. With this, we answer the objection that the slogan of the workers' government means nothing more than a parliamentary union. If the PSI rejects our proposal, then the masses will be persuaded that we have shown them a concrete way forward, while the PCI does not know what to do. Leon Trotsky, Scritti sul Italia, page 82. At the Rome Congress, the dissenting voices were a minority, easily identifiable in the right of the party around Tasca, who maintained a well-defined profile through the entire period leading up to the Lyon Congress. The group around the Ordine Nouveau fell in line with the positions developed by Bordiga and the comrades around him. These positions were expressed of the dominant sentiment in the rank and file of the party, of the need for the radical break not only with the moderate position of Turati, the leader of the openly reformist wing of the party, but also of the radical maximalism, i.e. centrism of Cerati, the party leader, which had proven itself incapable of leading the working classes and thus paved the way for fascism. The sectarianism had many genuine aspects. The task of communist leadership should have been to educate the rank and file, as so to limit and eventually eradicate these impulses. Instead, the Bordigas found the flames of ultra-leftism. And again, he doesn't say what exactly they did here, Sorti, but we need to consider that. I would also say we have to consider that I mentioned in the biography that one of the things that separates Bordiga's view of the vanguard in the part of the party vanguard and the traditional Trotskyist, Leninist, and in some ways even Marxist Leninist view of the vanguard of the party is that the party's role is primarily pedagogical, and then to establish the conditions which would be the dictatorship of the proletariat, whereas Bordiga thinks the party basically is the organ of the dictatorship of the proletariat. All right. Which is going to make stuff in the Lyon thesis all the more interesting. What I find interesting about this article is the actual content of Bordiga's version of the Lyon thesis isn't discussed here much. All right. The Rome theses did not stand the test of time. The coming power of fascism with the March on Rome in October 1922 refuted the perspective put forward by the readership. Yeah, everybody gets blindsided by fascism. Already, the creation of the anti-fascist movement, the Ardi del Popolo, a perfect example of the United Front organized from below, started to delineate the first post-Livorno differences between Bordiga and Gramsci. From Gramsci, quote, "Are the communists against the movement of the Arditi del Popolo? Quite the contrary. They strive for the creation of an armed proletarian force capable of defeating the bourgeoisie and to preside over the development and organization of a new productive forces generated by capitalism." Quoted in Spriano, 1940, page 143. Oops, not 1943. That's different. This was very far from the official position of the party executive, which can be seen here. We can only deplore the fact that certain comrades have been in contact with the Roman initiators of the Arditi del Popolo to offer their help and ask for instructions. If this were to repeat itself, harsher measures would be adopted. The Executive Committee of the Communist Party of Italy, and thus of the Communist Youth Federation of Italy, warn all comrades and all communist organizations to be extremely wary of any person who, in person or through correspondence, proposes to be found or act with units of the Arditi del Popolo. So don't work with the populist. From this incident alone, we see the limitations of Bordiga's dogmatic way of thinking. For him, there can be no tactical flexibility on the round to win over the majority of the proletariat to the communist program. This rigidity was at root of his abstentionist position and his opposition to a united front in the political sphere, also known as the United Front from Above. For example, furthermore, Bordiga saw no substantial difference between bourgeois democracy and a Bonapartist or fascist dictatorship, as both were forms of the domination of capital. This is going to be something repeated by left communists and also by council communists, who also, would talk about this. For Bordiga, the vanguard of the proletariat would become convinced of the correctness of the communist ideas on its own accord and would consequently join the party. It was enough to wait and educate the necessary cadres to be prepared when, at the 9th hour, the revolution will come. However, I just want to say this. I don't know that Bordiga thought that this was a education beyond making sure they understood the program of the Communist Party, of which Bordiga thought was invariant. All right. This kind of messianic waiting, however, has nothing to do with Marxism. This is why Bordigists have this stereotype that they're armchairist, because they think that basically you wait till you have power to do so. The clash begins. It's precisely on this question of the United Front that the differences between Gramsci and Bordiga came to light. Already, at the Fourth Congress of the Comintern, the line of the Communist Party of Italy had been subjected to harsh criticism by the International, which demanded the Italian leadership accept the line of the Congress, i.e. to adopt the United Front tactic aimed at the ranks of the PSI as means of uniting the whole of the advanced layers of the working class around the Communist Party and to guide the party on that basis. Although, for all the way Trotskyists insist on standing with Popular Front interpretations, United Front interpretations against Popular Front interpretations of the Comintern post 1937, and definitely post 1943. It is interesting to me how that this period of establishing a workers' government as a means of winning people over, which moves from the opposition to the held by Marx and Engels to doing positive politics as part of the United Front, is a shift that is unacknowledged by Trotskyists. Anyway, this confrontation yielded the first organizational diktat emitted towards the Communist Party of Italy at the hands of Zinoviev. Man, Zinoviev, if you see what Zinoviev does with the KPD and the KAPD and how he fucked around with the various parties in the United States, Zinoviev is, one of my least favorite of the left opposition, who used his authority to nominate a new executive committee with 3 members from the old majority: Forticiari, Scaramaro, and Tagliolati. Tagliolati is going to be later like the heroic leader of the Communist Party of Italy during its high Marxist-Leninist period after the war, and 2 from the right, Tosca and Volta. At the same time, the Comintern used its authority to nominate from above the leaders of the national section without the agreement of the designated leadership themselves. So we see parliamentary shenanigans going on. See below for the idea of the state of mind of this new leadership. Amadeo positions himself from the point of view of the international minority. We must position ourselves from the point of view of the national majority. Tagliolati. I don't know what that means. What is this attitude we assume politically? If the Fifth Congress, the party has healed from this crisis, if the consecutive nucleus in the center that has the trust of Italian masses thanks to its own actions rather than to the international situation, then we will have the luxury of criticizing. For now, it seems to me the best for us to avoid the question and buy time. Same piece by Togliatti. The opportunism will have a deep and negative consequences for the Communist Party of Italy. And I'll point this out that they're attacking Togliatti because while they are soft on Gramsci here at the IMT because Trotsky liked both Gramsci and Bordiga depending on the time, they can't be soft on Togliatti because Togliatti is a straight up Marxist-Leninist. He's a Stalinist. So, yeah. The Como Conference. The group around Gramsci defended a line that was more correct than that of the Bordigists. I would love to know how it was correct. But they were in the majority, and it was only because of circumstances in the will of Moscow that they found themselves leading the party. So, according to the Trotskyists here, according to the Grantite Trotskyists, Bordiga was incorrect, but he was procedurally right. Gramsci is correct, but wrong, and Togliatti and the right are opportunist. So that's their framing of what is going on here from the Trotskyist IMT perspective. Eventually, we're actually going to read the International Communist Party's introduction to the Lyon thesis, and you'll see their view of a lot of these events. The one leading the local sections were almost all with Bordiga. So the local section leadership was mostly in line with Bordiga. Bordiga actually had, despite his seeming ultra-leftism, the broadly popular opinion in Italy. So you're having contestation over whether or not the international minority will win or lose, right? Proof came at the special conferences held in Como in June 1924. Present were the secretaries of the local branches, the interregional secretaries, and the members of the Central Committee. There are only 3 documents up for discussion, one presented by Tosca's right wing, one from the center presented by Gramsci, and one from the left signed by Bordiga. Bordiga got the votes of 33 out of 45 local secretaries, 4 out of the 5 interregional secretaries, the representatives from the Youth Federation, and 1 CC member. Tosca got the votes of 5 local secretaries, 1 interregional secretary, and 4 CC members. Gramsci got 4 local secretaries and 4 CC members. So the center actually lost the worst. Just like in bourgeois politics, apparently. Anyway, the center was now leading the party was delegitimized from this vote. Even after such a clear result, Gramsci and his faction still did not contemplate allowing any challenges to their leadership. They didn't see that it was impossible to lead a communist party whose rank and file did not share the line of the leadership. But this, after all, was the method dictated by the secretary of the Comintern, which was aptly named Zinovievism. Yeah, Zinovievism sucks. This is Warren talking. Resolving a political question with organizational methods. Zinoviev was constantly doing this and constantly doing the shenanigans which broke up, which made it hard for groups in countries like the United States or Italy or for the KA payday and the K payday to reconcile. Not even in dealing with like trying to reconcile with the SPD. In the long run, this was to pave the way for the growth of bureaucracy within the party. Okay, how? Well, let's see how. According to Sorti, the party was reorganized directly by Moscow after the 5th Congress of the Comintern. The CC was enlarged to include 17 members, 9 from the center, 4 from the right, and 4 from the Terzini, the maximalist internationalist from the PSI, who joined the Communist Party of Italy. The executive committee was made up of 5 members with the center, Gramsci, Togliatti, and Scaramaro, and Scosimaro having a majority. Thus, the left was completely excluded from leading and the executive bodies of the party. And also, I believe Bordiga is in prison at this time. So we can say that the formation of the new leadership of the Communist Party of Italy, also the name of Togliatti's famous book about the period, was carried out through a series of forced organizational maneuvers which heavily impacted the future of the party. Basically, the Comintern actually forced the Italian Communist Party to change its structure so that the right people would win democratically when they had lost democratically before, which is a lot of the reason why a lot of people started opposing the Comintern, because they pulled stunts like this. All right. The opposition around Bordiga reacted by organizing itself more and more openly. In April 1945, with the Entente Committee to bring together all the elements of the left. In a fit of rage, the leadership removed all Entente members from any and all leadership positions they held. Forticiari, among others, was removed from the position of local secretary in Milan. So even some of the old guard that weren't with Bordiga get removed for being too ultra-leftist. You can see how this is going to cause a problem later. Disagreements between the leadership and the left spread to practically all aspects of Italian and international politics, including the debate unfolding in the USSR following Lenin's death. Aha, now Lenin's dead and we got an issue. Already at the Como conference, Gramsci had tried to draw parallels between Bordiga's opposition and Trotsky's position. Their position became even more divergent when Bordiga openly defended the founder of the Red Army in an article entitled The Trotsky Question, which is a good article, by the way, an article written in February 1925, blocked for months by the leadership and finally published in July during the height of the campaign against the left. This campaign, just so you know, will be led by like Paul Levy in Germany. I guess the KAPD. Whereas in Gramsci, we see an interest in the international question that is purely instrumental to the internal factional struggle in the Italian party. Bordiga was the first communist leaders outside of the USSR to grasp the danger of the degeneration of the Russian Revolution and to position himself firmly against it. Bordiga understood that the attack against Trotsky, launched by the budding Soviet bureaucracy, was only the most evident symptom of the degeneration of the USSR, which had already started to infect the international as well. On this question, the most important one for which world communist movement at that moment, Trotsky and Bordiga were jointly into a battle inside the international and met several times in the years from 1924 to 1926. Now, the Dutch and German communist left are fighting not getting liquidated in the consolidation of fascism in this kind of heyday of the Weimar period, and also being opposed by the SPD itself. This is a big mess. Particularly after the death of Karl, not Wilhelm, Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg at the hands of the Freikorps, and Ebert's seeming complicity with that. All right. However, the common struggle could not develop into a stable political alliance, as there were too many points of divergence between the Bolshevik Leninists, the supporters of Trotsky, and the dogmatic ultra-leftism of Bordigism. Okay, let's actually talk about the differences. Bordiga maintained that State and Revolution's reading of the Critique of the Goethe program was super important, but that there would be no markets in socialism. And these weren't different modes of production, but different stages of implementation only in relationship to the need for a state or the dictatorship of the proletariat to engage in rationing and accounting. Bordiga read time accounting as the primary organism and went back and forth whether or not direct rations or time rations are what were needed to deal with the situation of the transition from capitalism into socialism and communism. But he did not see socialism as a different mode of production where there were still markets and currency and whatnot. He was a currency abolitionist. And that way he's closer again to the Dutch and German council communist, to the left wing of the Communist Party of China in the 1960s and 70s, etc. Trotskyism does see socialism as a separate mode, following the Soviet understanding of that distinction. My reading is actually closer to Bordiga's as what Marx meant. I'm going to say that. It is unclear to me whether Marx thought that markets would be allowed. He seems to be speaking about time accounting being the thing shared by bourgeois and socialist societies, and that would have to go away eventually. Whether or not you think that's a separate mode of production is kind of a semantic debate, but an important semantic debate, and not one of them I'm going to belittle. All right. So that's one difference. Another difference is Trotsky maintained the united front of above and below, and Trotsky maintained the Bolshevik constitution of the Civil War period after 1921. That stuff, none of that stuff interested Bordiga particularly much, although Bordiga was also more centralist than Trotsky tended to be, even though Trotsky maintained democratic centralism that had been held since the Second International and the policies of the Lassalleans, which is where democratic centralism comes from. My friends, it does not come from Marx and Engels, even though Marx and Engels were centrist. They preferred centralism, but there was no statement of democratic centralism before then. Anyway, the assassination of Matteotti. During the Fifth Congress of the Comintern, the assassination of Giacomo Matteotti was carried out. Matteotti was a member of parliament for the Unitary Socialist Party, the PSU, the reformists led by Taranti, who had been expelled from the PSI in October 1922 for breaking the ban on making alliances with bourgeois parties. You couldn't form Popular Front yet. All right, so you can't make alliances with bourgeois parties. So the PSI got kicked out of the International. He paid the price for denouncing the fascist use of fraud and intimidation during the April 1924 elections. In a speech in Parliament, he was killed by a group of fascist hitmen. There was a great outburst of popular feeling, which led to a period of crisis for the fascist regime lasting a few months. On June 14, 1924, the MPs of the opposition party decided to boycott the parliament and form the opposition committee, and thus the withdrawal became known as the Avatine Succession, named after the hill where the plebeians, the Avatine Hill, were thought to have operated their own succession from the patricians in the Roman times. At first, the Communist Party joined its bloc, made up of all bourgeois opposition parties, except the right led by Orlando, Salandra, and Giolitti, as well as the Maximalists and Reformists. The opposition committee was democratic and legalistic movement. They refused the communist demand for a general strike. In their minds, the task of removing Mussolini from office belonged to the king and the judiciary. The communist group left the committee, and when on June 27, 1924, the CGL announced a 10-minute walkout in protest, the communists were the only ones who called for it to be transformed into a one-day general strike. However, after leaving the Aventine bloc, the Communist Party of Italy adopted an unclear position with the slogan "Down with the Assassins' government," which lacked clarity as to what would have placed the fascist government, and thus left the door open for collaboration with the opposition. Bordiga developed a critical position that was partially correct. The communists should either be part of the opposition committee or to fight it. The second opinion, however, lacked any proposal directed at the Maximalists and Reformists, who, as the elections a few months before shown, still had an important base within the working class. In the elections of April 6, 1924, held under a first-past-the-post system that scandalously favored the fascists, the PSU had won 415,000 votes. The Maximalist 341,000 votes, and the Communists 268,000 votes. This was a gratifying result for the Communists, given the party 19 deputies in Parliament. On the 15th of October, the Central Committee launched the slogan, "The Anti-Parliament," i.e. of transforming the Aventine opposition into a parliamentary assembly of opposition forces, the anti-parliament parliament. Yeah, got it. The Communist Party believes that bringing together all parliamentary groups of the opposition in an assembly convened on the basis of parliamentary regulations as a parliament opposed to the fascist parliament. This is in line with what Marxists would have historically done under Karl Marx and Engels' guidance. Would take on a very different meaning, as it would prolong the crisis and would remobilize the masses, which is the essential condition for an effective fight against fascism, thus invites the opposition forces to convene this assembly. Naturally, this proposal was rejected by all the other parties. The slogan launched by the Communist Party of Italy was trying to move past the passivity of the Aventine opposition, but was attempting to do so with a formulation that opened the door for collaboration between parties representing different classes, including Republicans, liberals, etc. If successful, This wouldn't have challenged the masses' illusions in bourgeois democracy, nor would it would have separated the workers in the PSI and the PSU from their reformist leadership. The left of the Communist Party, while reiterating its abstentionism on principle, reminded others that the line of the Third International was to exploit the parliamentary podium in a revolutionary way. The leadership accepted this, and on November 12, 1924, Luigi Ripassi, one of the communist MPs, gave a powerful speech pointing an accusing finger at the fascist government. This decision did not come without its repercussions. The Comintern first banned the communists from returning to parliament and then demanded that they only send one deputy and one delegate to the opposition committee. The latter, however, refused to receive even Gramsci. The wavering tactics of the Comintern, characteristic of Zinoviev's leadership, no one likes Zinoviev, were also applied to Italy with meager results. The king had no intention of getting rid of Mussolini, and the Aventine experience finally exhausted itself miserably. These kinds of joint ideology oppositions tend to run out of steam. See anti-Trumpism. Mussolini now passed a period of crisis, went on the offensive. In the famous speech in Parliament on December 1925, he claimed full responsibility for the assassination of Mattiatti and issued a series of decrees later known as the Legge Fascismi, the extraordinary fascist laws, resulting in the jailing of hundreds of opposition members and the definitive end of civil liberties, thus establishing his regime as a one-party dictatorship. The Lyon Congress. Just as Mussolini was tightening his totalitarian grip, the Third Congress of the Communist Party of Italy was held in Lyon from January 21st to January 26th of 1926. 4 years had passed since the Rome Congress, and all the changes that had been carried out within the party in that period were in full display. Firstly, this can be seen in the way the Congress was run and the voting method adopted. Usually open slate voting as opposed to secret ballot. The two documents were up for discussion, one from the center, which became known as the Lyon Thesis, and one from the Bordigist left, which is what we could call the Lyon Thesis. We'll read it. This document, drafted for the center, drafted by Gramsci, got over 90% of the votes, while the left only got 9.2%. It would thus seem that Gramsci had completely overturned the balance of forces since the Como Special Conference. But this is only partially true. Since the vote from the local sections were counted in a very strange way, all the members who didn't vote for the left were automatically counted as having voted for the center. So if you abstain, you voted for the center. That's funny. Man, Gramsci, you are up to some shit. I'm surprised Bordiga tried to defend you. All right. Comrades who weren't able to get to the congresses and wanted to vote for Bordiga had to do so via postal vote, which was unheard of in Italy at the time. Otherwise, they would be counted as supporters of the center. This rule was designed to allow the party executive to win a very wide majority and to complete the process of so-called Bolshevization of the party. The slogan with the Fifth Congress of the Comintern had concluded its proceedings. This Bolshevization, however, did not consist in educating cadres politically about the lessons drawn from the history of the Bolshevik Party under Lenin's leadership, but rather in the homogenization of practices and political positions under the diktats of the Comintern, which were undergoing a bureaucratic degeneration. Nice way of talking about Stalinism here. In the Third International after Lenin, Trotsky wrote, "The Bolshevization of 1924 assumed a completely the character of caricature. The revolver was held at the temples of the leading organs of the communist parties with the demand that they adopt immediately a final position in internal disputes in which the CPSU without any information and any discussion. And besides, they were aware in advance whether or not they could remain in the Comintern dependent on the position that they took." Part 4, Section 11, the question of the internal party regime. In the Lyon Theses, factions were explicitly prohibited. Oh, man. After 1921, people loved their faction bans. Although Trotskyists are also often guilty of encouraging faction bans because they, too, hold to the post-1921 Bolshevik organizational stances as opposed to the 1918 ones. Anyway, the theses added to the tendencies were possible, but it didn't take much to compare these to the ones used by Stalin regarding the left opposition, that's Trotskyist, Zinovianist, etc., in the CPSU. In the context of the factional fight of the Communist Party of Italy, these words were tantamount to a threat of expulsion, which were later, in fact, concretized by the majority. The threat was also made explicit. Quote, ultra-leftism must be combated as such, and not just through propaganda, but through political action and, if necessary, organizational methods. Paragraph 27. The document also contraposed local organization on the basis of production, factory cells, to territorial branches imposed by the Bolshevization process, which, in fact, had very little to do with the Bolshevik method, as it entailed a rigid and pre-established model of organization and objectively favored stricter control by the apparatus. This is the Trotskyists saying, like, they're not doing Bolshevism right because they're basing it off of post-1921 Bolshevism or 1925 Bolshevism, as opposed to OG Lenin to 1918 Bolshevism. All right. We'll get back to that later. The Lyon theses were an expression of the contradictions facing the leadership of the Communist Party of Italy at the time. On one hand, they were the concretation of the struggle to apply the resolutions of the Third and Fourth Congresses of the Comintern to the Italian situation, especially in regard to tactics. On the other hand, they suffered the consequences of the new course of the International, especially from the organizational point of view, and defended the political mistakes made in Italy since the Meotti assassination. The theses were fully embraced the teachers of the Russian Revolution when they affirmed, quote, capitalism and its predominant element in the Italian society, and with the force derisive in determining its development. This fundamental fact means that there is no possibility of a revolution in Italy that is not a socialist revolution. Paragraph 4. This ruled out the necessity of a democratic phase led by the bourgeoisie in complete opposition to the line promoted by Togliatti from 1943 onwards. Yeah, so the MLs actually after 1943 favor we need a democratic phase led by the bourgeoisie, of which we are acting in concert, and a popular front. Togliatti is taking the popular front line, which is picked up by the Allies, of which Stalin is one after 1943. Therefore, forward. All right. And, quote, in Italy, there is a confirmation of the thesis that the most favorable conditions for the proletariat revolution did not necessarily always occur in those countries where capitalism and industrialization have reached the highest level of development, but may instead arise from the fabric of capitalist system offers the least resistance because of structural weakness by the attack of the revolutionary class and its allies. The role of the proletariat as a protagonist of the Italian revolution was forcefully reiterated. Quote, the proletariat appears as the only element which by its nature has a unifying function capable of coordinating the whole of society. Its class program is a unitary program. So what this is kind of arguing is Gramsci's faction. It's kind of classical Leninist. Yes, they're Marxist-Leninists. Yes, they don't really oppose Stalin. Gramsci's relationship to Stalin is kind of hampered by the fact he dies before that's really fully reconciled. Whereas Togliatti takes on the post-1943 Stalin Popular Front, concessions to markets, etc. stance. Now, Marxist-Leninists today often don't recognize that like the Comintern and formerly Comintern aligned parties after the Comintern is dissolved took radically different stances under Stalin's leadership, and that Marxist-Leninism from, say, third periodism to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and then after 1943 with the Allies, all are very different in their general orientations. And people doing, trying to resurrect Marxist-Leninism today in non-historical parties, which is usually like on Twitter or something, or on YouTube, etc., tend to do so with a melange of different periods, positions that they kind of ram together. Anyway, back to this. The Lyon theses were, in fact, the first congressional document of the Communist Party of Italy to raise the need for a united front tactic, as developed in the Third and Fifth Congresses of the Comintern. Quote, the tactics of the United Front as political activity, maneuver designed to unmask so-called proletarian and revolutionary parties and groups have been a mass base, is closely linked with the problem of how the Communist Party leads to the masses and how it wins the majority. Paragraph 42. Additionally, the party implemented a rectification against Bordiga schematism. The party combats the conception according to one should abstain from supporting or taking part in partial actions because the problems with the interests of the working class can only be solved by the overthrow of the capitalist order and by the general action on the part of all anti-capitalist forces. At the same time, the correct theoretical analysis does not equally lead to effective slogans. With demands such as the Republican Assembly on the basis of the Workers' and Peasants' Committee advanced as a synthetic formula for all the party's activities insofar that it proposes to create an organized, united front of the working class. Paragraph 41. This slogan was criticized by Trotsky both in his correspondence with the Bordigist group Primateo and also with Tresso, Leonardi, and Ravazzoli, three Communist Party of Italy leaders who were to join the Trotskyist International Left Opposition. And remember, left oppositionism, left communism, not the same thing. All right. Anyway, speaking of which, isn't it the Ercole, Togolotti's Comintern alias, who is trying to adapt to the Italian context the idea of democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry in the form of the demand for the constituent assembly based on workers' and peasants' assemblies, Leon Trotsky. The democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry was adopted by Lenin, but specifically for the context of what we would after in world systems theory words called the periphery countries such as Russia. This democratic dictatorship of the proletarian peasant eventually expands to stuff like the Maoist mass line, but initially it was the dictatorship of the proletariat leading the way with the peasantry as part of the laboring masses, etc., etc. And Trotsky was kind of opposed to this. This is one of the reasons why Trotsky was somewhat supportive of the Red Terror because of the conflicts with the peasants, as Bukharin and the people who proposed the NEP wanted to kind of slowly fold the peasants in. And that's just something to know. And so Trotsky's probably sympathetic to the Bordigists on this, actually. Anyway, quote, and you remind me of the time I criticized the demand for the Republican Assembly on the basis of the workers' and peasants' communes launched by the Italian Communist Party. You tell me that this demand had a mere episodic character and that it is currently have been abandoned. However, I want to tell you why I consider this demand to be wrong and at least ambiguous as a political slogan. A Republican Assembly is undeniably a body of the bourgeois state. Take that, Marxist Republicanists who think that they're consistent with Trotsky. Anyway. What are workers' and peasants' committees, on the other hand? It is obvious that they are in some way equivalent to the workers' and peasants' Soviets. So this must be stated. And their quality of class organ of the poor, working, and peasant masses, regardless of whether or not you call them Soviets or committees, there always has constituted an organizational struggle against the bourgeois state. To them become an insurrectional organs and finally transform into the organs of proletarian dictatorship. How could it be possible that these conditions in these conditions that a Republican Assembly, a supreme organ of the bourgeois state, could be an organ of the proletarian state? Trotsky. So for those of you who think that Trotsky and Bordigists are super off, and a lot of Bordigists today will tell you that, they're not on this question. The main tragedy of the Lyon Congress lay therefore in the adoption of a position that reflected the essential traits of the line approved by the International of its first four Congresses, but at the wrong moment. Had this political line been adopted at the right moment, i.e. in 1921, it would have made the rise to the power of fascism far from inevitable. Maybe. That's a big claim. And would have allowed for the reorganization of the Italian proletariat. Well, given that fascism is partly based off the war, I'm not totally sure about that. But we can come back. The moment in 1926 was wrong because it coincided with the bureaucratic degeneration of the Third International, which inevitably to mark the future development of the Italian Communist Party. I get really kind of like Trotskyists tend to be like, this was right then, but 6 years later it's wrong because this other thing happened. But if it had happened when we wanted it to happen, everything would be right. And I just find this like tendency for counterfactuals like this to be not particularly helpful. All right. For the point of view of the international balance of forces, the Lyon Congress marked the defeat of the Bordigists left within the Communist Party of Italy. Bordiga suffered the same fate on the international level in February 1926 when he was sidelined from the enlarged executive committee of the Comintern. The Communist Party of Italy, meanwhile, was suffering widespread repression at the hands of the fascist government throughout 1926, with a large part of the leadership arrested and imprisoned, including Gramsci, who was to die in 1937 without ever seeing freedom again. That's why the question of Gramsci's relationship to Stalin is somewhat in question, because Gramsci's in prison from 1926 till his death in 1937. He does reconcile, according to two sources that I found, somewhat with Bordiga on when they were mutually imprisoned in 1929 and 1930, but we don't really know how far that reconciliation went and how much Gramsci really believed in the Bolshevization of the party beyond what he was trying to do to maintain a maximalist center position within the Communist Party of Italy. The ideas put forward by Trotsky and the left opposition were to be taken up a few years later by three members of the leadership of the Communist Party of Italy, Traverso, Ravazzoli, and Leonetti. But they were all taken up. This will be taken up in another article. Yeah, it's not related to us here either. Suffice it to say that the unhealthy bureaucratic Zinovieanite methods used to defeat Bordiga, albeit to impose the correct position of the United Fronts, nonetheless prepared the grounds for the Stalinization of the party under Tagliati. And this gets you into one of the things that I find so interesting about Trotskyists, who try to maintain a defensive position towards the USSR, but also condemning almost everything the USSR actually did during this time period. Because there's a lot of like, well, this was right if they just done it before this other way, and the Zinovieanite methods were wrong, but even though they were being used for the right position, blah 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 blah. This gets you in the kind of issues that you get trying to maintain the left opposition in a democratic form of it, while also trying to deal with the fact that the same methods that were used to shut out Trotsky were used to being shut out the ultra left, and that would eventually be used on Zinoviev and Kamenev and their factions themselves. So there you go. All right, like and subscribe, hit the bell if you want more like this. You can always find it. We have we're gonna cover a Jacobin interview on Bordiga that coincided with the release of a good translation by Brill Haymarket of Bordiga's writings, because there's not that many of them. Some of them I used to find translated from French, from Italian into English. It was a mess. And then we're going to get into the International Communist Party's introduction to the Lyon theses, and then we're going to read the Lyon theses together, and I'm going to tell you my opinions of them as part of a preparation for an article I am writing on Bordiga. All right. Thank you. Have a great day.